Hello, everybody, and welcome to We Measure the World, a podcast produced by scientists for scientists.
And then the group was like, hey, let's test the radioactivity of these reclaimed soils. The radioactivity was gone, and so they started growing rice. I went out and planted rice one day. I've never done anything like that. I grew up spending a lot of time on a farm. We had a giant seeder that, our drills would put down the seed. Well, here they grow these rice seedlings in the hoop houses, and they bring them out, and we'd put the plugs in. And so there I was kind of, calf deep in the mud, new experience. I'm not great with bare feet, right? And I'm out there like, I don't know this, do you have any shoes? But we were out there planting rice with this whole group. There were probably 30 or 40 volunteers, and we were out there just plugging this rice into the soil. Just this experience, I'm like, I never thought that I would be planting rice by hand.
We Measure the World explores interesting environmental research trends, how scientists are solving research issues, and what tools are helping them better understand measurements across the entire soil-plant atmosphere continuum. Today's guest is Dr. Colin Campbell, who has been a research scientist at METER for 21 years, following his PhD at Texas A&M University in soil physics. He is currently serving as Vice President of METER Environment and is also adjunct faculty with the Department of Crop and Soil Sciences at Washington State University, where he co-teaches environmental biophysics, a class he took over from his father, Galen, nearly 20 years ago. Dr. Campbell's early research focused on field-scale measurements of CO2 and water vapor flux, but has shifted toward moisture and heat flow instrumentation for the soil-plant atmosphere continuum. And today he's here to talk with us about his collaboration with environmental scientists working in Fukushima, Japan. So welcome, Colin.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
Yeah. So I would assume that the majority, if not all of our audience, are familiar with the 2011 Fukushima nuclear power plant disaster triggered by huge earthquakes, tsunami. But I'm wondering how did you get involved in this situation? And can you just tell us a little bit about the backstory of how that came to be?
Yeah, there's a ton of backstory, and so we can go through it. And maybe I'll start and then just keep backing up from the original. So I was friends with Professor Masaru Mizuguchi at the University of Tokyo, and I've spent a lot of time in Japan. And when the disaster happened, it was, I think like most, looking at it on the news, looking at these incredible pictures of walls of water moving through these beautiful Japanese communities. And of course, didn't really connect, but we saw this problem with the nuclear reactor when the seawater inundated the engine room, the support engine room, the diesel generators, which were supposed to be kind of the secondary cooling mechanism of the reactors. And it's, as I understand it, at that point we had meltdown. We know that there was a large plume of radioactive cesium that was released into the atmosphere. And so these are the things we saw in the news. And like many news stories, we saw that and were concerned about it. But there wasn't, like so many things, immediately I didn't think, hey, what can I do about this? Mm-hmm. I thought, oh, this is a real challenge. I wish there was something I could do about it, but like so many news stories, they pass on. You kind of forget about them, and really this nuclear disaster actually evolved over time, right? It wasn't that same moment that the tsunami came in. Right. It was days later where they ended up not being able to cool the reactor, and we had a breach, and then we had this plume of radioactive cesium. Environmentally speaking, the process was pretty straightforward. We had this plume, went up into the upper atmosphere. It kind of slowly moved over with the prevailing wind. And it was March 11th, right? And mid-March, and in Japan, in this particular location, the Fukushima prefecture, that meant snow. And so it snowed on this area. And specifically the thing that we've come to really know as Fukushima, quote unquote, is not actually Fukushima. Fukushima is a city and it's a prefecture. It's an area. And within that, there's a little little is maybe the wrong word for it, but a beautiful mountainous region that's kind of across a divide from the Fukushima, the city, which is Iitate village. And it's not really a village I expected when I went there to see a village. It's not really a village. It's just a community of spread out homes in this beautiful mountainous region of Japan. And that cloud essentially went over to this region, couldn't make it over the mountains that are kind of blocking Fukushima, and snowed right there on Iitate village. I didn't know anything about this. Mostly what I knew about it was that disaster happened. We did have this reactor breach, and there was a problem, but the problems were all around. In fact, most of the things that we connect with were things that I visited. In one trip, we got to go to the area of Sendai, and we saw where the tsunami had come in, and it had wiped out all these rice fields, wiped out this beautiful little school, killing many of these school children. Just sad, sad stories. So the impact there was really recognizable, right? The rice fields have been destroyed. How are we going to recover from this? We were helping in the recovery by deploying some of our conductivity temperature depth sensors there to look at, hey, how's the water? Are we getting from salt water, which isn't going to grow anything, back to a fresh water? So in this location, it was easy to see the damage. The damage was clear. It came in, it destroyed all this land. We had all this big machinery trying to put it back the way it was. The school was there. We got to visit the school and just really, feel the suffering of this people. On the other, not far away was Iitate village, and there was no tsunami in Iitate village. It's up in the mountains. There was no kind of panic there. Nothing happened there that was fast. This cloud came over in perfect silence, right, and snowed down there in Iitate. And little did we know that this other environmental disaster, this in some ways further reaching environmental disaster, was occurring right there. And so really the first thing I knew about it was Dr. Mizoguchi. We call him Mizo. He's a wonderful man. And if you go on Meter's website, there you can see videos of Mizo. And he wrote me and he said, Colin, there are a lot of us who are really concerned about this Iitate village area. It wasn't where the tsunami went, but the agricultural impacts and the personal impacts of this particular incident were far more reaching, and fewer people are involved. Is it possible that you could figure out how to plug a Geiger counter into an EM50? So EM50s were our data logger at the time, and he wondered if we could somehow get a voltage output from one of these devices and read it on our data logger, so we could create a history of what was going on there and trying to understand the impacts of the radiation fallout and the snow that came, and see what we could do over time. And we said, yeah, of course, let's see what we can do. And it was kind of cool at the time. In Japan, they have a kind of entrepreneurial culture. So when we actually went over there, it was several months after the disaster, but we went over there for a visit, and we got to sit down with some of these groups that, hey, I do biological engineering most of the time in this little startup, but we really want to help our countrymen here in the Iitate area in Fukushima. And what we want to do is put together a little Geiger counter that will help, a cheap, inexpensive device that we can just deploy there and just get an idea of, hey, what's the radiation level? How is it changing over time? What is the impact? And so that's really how we got introduced to Mizo and his group of friends. And it's truly a group of friends, right? It's not there was nothing dictated that said, hey, you need to go and help these people. But a group of people said, this has happened, and we feel morally responsible to help, to try to change the world in whatever way we can. And that's kind of how we got introduced, was we sat down there. Remember, at his desk at the University of Tokyo, we had this long table. We sat around. We said, hey, what are some of the things that we could do, however small, to try to change the impact of this disaster.
Right. How extensive was the impact amongst Iitate village
and the agricultural surroundings there, and what exactly was going on. You talked about this cloud of radioactive cesium. You talked about the snowfall then that then brought the cesium down into their fields. From that point on, what happens to their to their fields, to their rice, to their livelihoods?
Yeah, it's a great question, and one that I didn't know. Right, our biggest experience really with any of this is Chernobyl, which kind of evolved in a very different way. The community in Japan is extremely strong, as you know, and so after this happened, there really wasn't a complete understanding of what the impacts were, but everybody kind of knew one thing, that the people in Iitate village needed to leave. And so the people were as quickly as possible, and I don't know what time scale that was in, taken out of their homes in Iitate, and they moved essentially over into Fukushima, into the city of Fukushima. And, from when we would travel around there, it was one of these really eerie ghost towns initially when we went in there, that there were people and then there weren't people. And so houses, nothing happened like this great tsunami that pushed houses over and destroyed things. It was pristine in the village. But what essentially happened was, through the cracks in the asphalt, were growing weeds, right? And the stores that you would recognize as a functioning store somewhere else in Japan, it was there, but the doors were closed and no one was in the parking lot. And so essentially people were just, the government came through and said, hey, you must leave, and people left. And I don't, the timeline's not clear to me, but when they left, they went over into kind of some refugee centers. And after a while, the government was able to house a lot of the people of Iitate in kind of manufactured, small manufactured trailers or homes with small community centers. But they were situated in parking lots that they put people where they could. And I visited one of these relocation areas even 4 or 5 years after this, and the people are still living there and trying to wait to see what happens. At the same time, the government kind of immediately responded to try to deal with the radiation. And also there are a lot of people from around the world that kind of mobilized and came in, and the radiation was such that people could go into the area for a day, right? And they wore their radiation tags to see how much dosing they had over a day, but they could go in there. And essentially what people were doing was going into the homes, going into the parking areas around the homes and trying to clean those things, to try to wash them all down and remove the radiation. And so that was initially what happened, was that people all simply left the area, just grab, the stuff you need and go out. And there was a large response from the government and kind of concerned citizens from around the world who came in to try to clean.
So yeah, exactly. I mean, that goes into my next question about what was the government doing, both local and national government, to not only, clean up the city itself or the village itself, but then that next step, what were they doing to help clean up or remediate that radioactive fallout there in the soils itself?
Yes. So when you see the village and you think about the radioactivity raining down on the village, the thing that's hard to conceptualize is how widespread the radioactivity is, because this area isn't just kind of a wide open town. There are these gorgeous mountain forests, just thick with vegetation. I mean, I've walked kind of up to them, and they're not forests that I'm used to. Here in the Pacific Northwest, I go out in the forest and you can kind of walk among the trees and really enjoy yourself. You can kind of make your own path. In the forests of this Iitate village area in the Fukushima prefecture, that, at least my impression is, that when I walked up to there, it wasn't going to be kind of a really easy way to get into the forest. They were also very steep and rugged. And so cleaning up this area was a tall task. So what happened was, essentially, first of all, we need to clean up the houses and the surroundings within, let's say 50 meters around the house. And then the thought was, we need to clean up the farmland. And that's really where I started to get involved in this more deeply, is that the people we worked with, specifically Dr. Mizuguchi and others, were looking at this challenge of how do we remediate the farmland from an ecological point of view. And when you think about it, and we've talked about this before in other videos that Meter has made, but the upper 10 centimeters of soil is a critical zone where we have organic matter, we have microbes, we have all these things working in concert to create this high fertility that grows rice or whatever, particularly in this area, the rice. And the plan by the government, and I understand why they wanted to do this, because we needed to clean up a very difficult situation. Their plan was to essentially remove the top 10 centimeters of soil. They bagged them up, they put them in the center of Iitate. Now there is a little village area and they were in the center, but it's far more spread out than you kind of, when I say village, doesn't look like kind of what pops into the mind for a village. And so they removed the soil, and then they went to a mountain and they were taking down this mountain, crushing the granite that was in this mountain, forming it into kind of sand, about sand-sized particles. And then they'd lay that back down. So you can imagine just scraping the surface of the soil, kind of bagging that all up. These bags, I've seen them here in the Northwest. They're things that bag wheat, right? Or beans or lentils or something. That's what they put them in. These were the soil bags. And they're not made to last forever, right? They're just canvas bags, but that's what they had. And they now, if you go there, there are huge piles of these canvas bags covered with now tarping. And the hope is that, they stay there, but the challenge is these aren't going to last forever. So that was their plan. And Mizo looked at that and said, look, from an ecological point of view, if you remove all this topsoil, you essentially kill the soil. Let's not speak too strongly about that, but you're taking away much of what makes a soil a soil. And so he devised a plan that because there were rice fields and because of the soil that was there, it's pretty heavy clay, that clay has binding sites for cesium. It's kind of a cool confluence of science and chemistry, or physics and chemistry, where we have these clay particles, they're charged on the surface, and that cesium will bind there. And he said, what if we went ahead on these rice fields that get mixed anyway, and that we can flood anyway? What if we went ahead and mixed these things up and made just like this milkshake of soil? And what if we took all that water off into a pit? What would change about the radioactivity of the soil? And so he did a few experiments and even did this on a few fields. And the amazing thing was that we mixed it up, all the sand and the silt would kind of sink to the bottom. The clay would remain in suspension. And then you could just poke a little hole in the dike of this rice field and let all the water run out into a pit. And if you covered that pit, the radiation that is emitted by the cesium, the gamma radiation, can't go very far in soil. So it would be perfectly safe for humans to be there if you cover that up. And then they found that the radiation was virtually gone from the field. Now, they did this on a few fields. It's harder work. And in the end, the government said, hey, thank you so much for doing this, but we want to get this taken care of. And there are a lot of fields there, and they didn't use this technique. But it was a cool way. All the fields that were done like that, one of the farmers that we worked with there, we remediated his field that way. I was there that day when we did it. Such a wonderful experience. So many volunteers coming down from Tokyo and surrounding, just taking their weekend and working there. And we completely removed the radiation from this field. We had all this instrumentation out to measure it and do the things that I love to do. And then after that, we had this beautiful field that was devoid of radiation that he went and planted all these beautiful irises in. So when I came back 2 years later, there was just this huge field of irises. And just, his, Akubo-san, as I recall, was the name of the farmer. And he just said, I'm old and I just want to turn this area into a thank you site to those people who came and served. And he put all the names of the people who came up on a sign and planted trees, beautiful trees for those people individually there in a little orchard. So that was some of the stuff we did, and some of the early work that we did out there.
So with the government's efforts and saying, thanks but no thanks with this project, was it just a matter of it not being cost effective in their mind, too time extensive, that kind of thing?
It's a great question. It was time intensive, cost effective. I think it could have been done effectively, but one of the challenges we have as soil scientists is that we're not necessarily. Can I say this about us? We're not necessarily mainstream, like I know my kids go to school. They're like, hey, what does your dad do? Well, he's a soil scientist, right? And they're like, oh, well, let's move on, right? So there may have been a component of like, hey, we've got this, I know you guys want to do the ecological thing. We kind of know what we are doing. And also, it's maybe easier to mobilize, and mobilize it was. There were hundreds, thousands of workers driving trucks, dumping this, this crushed granite on fields and rolling it on. It just seemed like they came up with the plan and they wanted to execute the plan. And I understand that at some level, but ecologically speaking, we came back, and I've said that a few times. And the reason I'm talking about that is that we went out there and I looked at these fields and there were some decontaminated fields and some that hadn't been decontaminated sitting right by each other. And of course, I mentioned weeds, and that's what the fields were growing, right? Because everybody had left. And so no one was farming the fields during this time. And the decontaminated field just looked like a barren field. I just saw this crushed granite, kind of a light brown color laying out there. And I saw most of the soil. And right next to it, there were just these fields of weeds growing. And the weeds were kind of speaking for the ecology, saying, hey, this isn't really our ideal situation. Maybe we'll come back to that one day, but this new soil is not really very easy to grow.
I was going to say, is crushed granite, I mean, how did they come up with that idea of, is it a viable replacement for the soil that's there, or at least for that medium?
Yeah, so I would say eventually, maybe that not. I mean, imagine, so is, when you take your first soil science class, you talk about soil forming factors, right? Here are the 5 soil forming factors. And essentially the government said, hey, we're going to participate in soil forming. We're going to go to this hill that has granite and we're going to crush it into small little bits. And then we're going to, lay it out. And so soil, I mean, it has a portion of the soil, right? The small particles, that define soil, and yet it has no cation exchange capacity. It has no ability to even if it were extremely small, the ability of clay to bind cesium, this crushed granite did not have that, right? And the mineralogy of it, which I don't know, I never test. I'm not exactly sure, was this quartz, what made up this granite? And yet, as a soil scientist, you would say, well, this is kind of a pre-soil. This is a soil that's just brand new and beginning to form. Soil forms over thousands of years, right? So this is not going to be a viable solution without other inputs like fertilizer and things to do that. And one of the other questions we had about the soil and the process was, hey, this is great to have kind of a soil put down, but what other properties does it have? So we used our Saturo, the dual head infiltrometer, and went out there and measured it. One of our campaigns over there was just to say, hey, what is the impact of this? And on that trip, we went to Akubo-san's farm, and they were just remediating the last rice field. And there on the rice field was a roller, like a something you use on a road, a big industrial instrument. The guy's driving a roller up and down on the soil that they've just laid there. And there's one thing I know about soil is that you don't want to drive a roller on it, right? You just can compact the heck out of it. And so we went off with the Saturo and we measured, in this field that they'd remediated, actually multiple fields. And the data came back, it was somewhere between, kind of an extremely compact soil and a concrete in terms of our ability to infiltrate water in there. And I'm not saying this won't change. And I'm not saying that plants can't be grown in this. It just creates a challenge. And I understand why it was done, but it is kind of an interesting thing to think about as we deal with disasters, and presumably we'll continue to have this as a society, as humans living on Earth, that considering the ecological, the biological consequences of making certain choices, it should be done rather deeply. And I know people thought about this, but it's a challenge.
In speaking of kind of the ecological impacts, were there other environmental impacts that they were concerned about? I mean, you talked about these dense forests that are around in the surrounding areas, concerns with runoff or leaching or maybe other things like that. But then at the same time, you have these weeds that are growing. The old Jurassic Park adage that life finds a way type of thing. Right. Can you speak to some of those concerns?
Yeah, so I guess we had a hierarchy of thinking as we approached this remediation. And again, I want to reiterate, I played a very small role in this. We tried to support as much as we could. We visited regularly. We were at the site, but there are some amazing individuals that were really putting a lot of energy into this, and so many that I can't name by name, but there are these individuals who made it their weekend work every weekend to go up and donate time to this effort. And so initially we're thinking about rice fields, and with another farmer we worked with, Mineo-san, just this wonderful gentleman and his wife that we got to work with. First, we focused on the fields, right? And this boundary around the house. And then eventually we started thinking, okay, what are we going to do about the mountains, the runoff and things like that? So, but certainly even early on, we had samplers out in the stream, didn't put them there. Somebody did, these ISCO samplers were out there sampling the stream water, seeing what was coming down and runoff. Because big problem. If you've got contamination in the mountains, that's going to move, or it can potentially move. Cool thing about having a lot of clay out there is that it's going to bind that and hopefully keep it in place. But if we have a lot of runoff, where we have, in a world of climate change where we get these more intense storms coming through, we can then drive that runoff, and we see, some bulk movement of soil. And if we get that, especially where we get clay in suspension, that can move, and it can move a long ways. So thinking about retention, how do we retain this, and then clean up whatever kind of retention ponds are there, and make sure that gets done was in the consciousness of the group.
And you mentioned in passing a few times now these volunteers that would come down and help out. I was wondering if you had any stories of those, and what they were doing specifically to help out with this effort.
So, one of the things about being able to visit there every year is that I wasn't there every weekend, but I could see the progress. So one of the things that they thought about when we, kind of in conjunction with this challenge of the soil, and not really as a result, but we knew that the soil wasn't going to be super productive because it was so dang hard, right? The water didn't infiltrate very well. It didn't have a lot of fertility. So they set up some greenhouses so Mineo-san could go out and grow some crops, and then, that wouldn't be in contaminated soil. And then hopefully the people of Japan would want to support these farmers who are coming back to their land by purchasing the crops grown. So first time it came back, there were these beautiful hoop houses set up to grow, and a lot of the electrical engineers, the gadget guys, had been setting up little control systems so Mineo-san could set it up, and they'd irrigate, based on the soil moisture in the root zone, and he could grow crops and harvest them and sell them, which was a great, a great idea. And it even worked. And then the group was like, hey, let's test the radioactivity of these reclaimed soils. The radioactivity was gone. And so they started growing rice. I went out and planted rice one day. I've never done anything like that. I grew up spending a lot of time on a farm. We had a giant seeder that, our drills would put down the seed. Well, here they grow these rice seedlings in the hoop houses. then you bring them out and we'd put the plugs in. And so there I was kind of, calf deep in the mud, new experience. I'm not great with bare feet, right? And I'm out there like, I don't love this. Do you have any shoes? But we were out there planting rice with this whole group. There were probably 30 or 40 volunteers. And these volunteers were PhD students and professors at the university and, bank managers and people who'd heard, that were friends with friends and came out, and they were all down there. And we were out there just plugging this rice into the soil. Just this experience. I'm like, I never thought that I would be planting rice by hand. It is not. And I even worked on rice as a PhD student. but again, here in the United States, we don't plant rice that way. After we finished planting the rice, I didn't know this, but you kind of have a planting celebration, and there was no facility to support us there, so we rolled out this giant tarp, and somebody brought in. I didn't imagine I'd love them, but bento boxes. Now I love them. Everybody had a lunch, right? And we passed out, some rice balls and bento boxes, and we all sat down cross-legged on the tarp, and I don't remember exactly. I think it was Maneo's son, his grandfather. I can't remember. I think over 100 years old. Came, very frail older gentleman, and he sang the harvest song, or the planting song to the group. This long song about the meaning of planting and the meaning of being able to harvest in this situation, and it was amazing. And many people had tears in their eyes just because it was a rebirth there, right? There were people who came out, and it meant enough to get Maneo's son and his family back on the land that they did this. And the next time I came there in the same spot, just a little off the side, was a brand new house. They had built, Maneo's son, they tore down this old house there. They built a new house, and they created in the house a headquarters. In addition, so Maneo's son, his family lived in the house, and also a little area for the students that were coming and experimenting there from the University of Tokyo, University of Utsunomiya, and other places. And also the volunteers, they would come out, plan their work there. This beautiful wood house. I can still remember the smell. It was just fresh and new. Got to go in there, we planned our work, and then we were out there, doing things. So each time I came back, just little steps. We went to a restaurant that had opened up and was completely serving food from Iitate village, from the villagers, from the greenhouses, and from this decontaminated field. So cool experiences.
That's awesome. That's great. I know you've mentioned this, and maybe for our purposes with cutting, you have talked about some of your interactions with some of the farmers that you've dealt with. I was wondering if you had any other stories or interactions with people from the village. Was everyone in the village connected to the farmers in some way, or did they have their own separate specialties that then they worked on? Did you interact with any of the other people from the village there?
I think one of the hardest parts of going to a village like Iitate was that, first of all, the population of Iitate was generally older. In fact, at the time, and I don't know what the current statistic is, the mean age of a Japanese farmer is 69. Wow. A lot of the young people have just moved off the farms, and a lot of the people that were displaced during this disaster were elderly people. In fact, mostly not young. There's a school there, and there were some young people, but by and large, elderly people. And so the language barrier was really challenging. And so even talking to Maneo's son and trying to kind of, I wanted to get a feeling for the impact of the challenge in his life. For me, it helped me connect with what had happened and really understand on a very personal level what the meaning was. Because as we are far away from it, it's in the news and things, the personal nature of this kind of disaster isn't necessarily something we understand. And so I did get a little bit of that, but it wasn't until actually early this year, we had a large Zoom conference where we all got together and talked about Fukushima and some of the research that we'd done. And we had in-time interpretation there. So it's fun in Japan. Sometimes we can get interpretation that just essentially runs real time. And some of the, and Muneo-san got up and he talked in this conference. And finally, I kind of heard him speak about the challenge, about the disaster, about his family, and about what it meant to be able to come back. And it was incredible. It was not something, through Mizo or one of our colleagues here, Sean Weldon, went with me over to do some work there. He speaks Japanese, but it's really, he can translate some for me, but he's listening and connecting. And for me, I'm often kind of, okay, so what did they say, right? But I finally got that opportunity to hear about the challenges of Muneo-san and his family and what it meant to one day just lose everything. I mean, this is something that had been in his family, right? It had been for years and years. And one day suddenly they were living in a square box, in a parking lot in Fukushima. And the impact of some of the things that happen in the world, I mean, I think it's important that we think about scale, right? Seeing it on the news is not like it happens to the people there.
You gave a really good overview of the project then that Mizo and that you were helping out with. Can you go into a bit more detail about what exactly were you measuring? How did that process flow? Those other things that you're trying to do in solving the problems there in the village.
So originally we weren't really sure what we should be doing, right? Mizo went out to test ideas even before I ever got there of does cesium really bind to the clay particles? And if we kind of look at where cesium is in the soil profile, would we see what we expect to see, that the cesium is up on the surface? So that was the initial part of this, to try to understand where's the cesium and how to capture it, essentially, to remediate this area. But at the same time, a lot of what we were doing was deploying instrumentation. So just weather instrumentation, trying to understand what's happening with the weather there. Where are we seeing humidity? What's the temperature? What's the solar radiation? What's the wind speed? And all these kind of things. And then try to understand. You put cameras out to try to understand what is going to happen with the flora and fauna around. Especially, they had the wild boars. And you wouldn't really think about wild boars and monkeys in the conversation, but they're there. And so the wild boars would come out in the fields because nobody was there to really stop them, and they dig up the fields. And so this idea of trying to keep the cesium in a spot because of clay, well, everything might have been great, except the wild boars are coming out and kind of mixing up the soil and digging in it and trying to find roots and all that kind of stuff. So initially, a lot of our efforts was really environmental, soil moisture, that kind of stuff. And it moved to trying to understand the impacts of some of the government work on the soil. So like I talked about, I mentioned the infiltration. That was one of our big things, try to understand that, the fertility of the soil, and then turning towards some of these other opportunities like these greenhouses that were able to grow plants in essentially suspended media or reclaimed media in the soil. And it, when you think of the scope of this effort, sometimes you think, well, that's not a ton of stuff, right? What are you guys doing? This was all focused on really getting the villagers to return, which they did, which was an amazing time. Early on when we were going there, we'd spend time there and it was eerie. You'd see one government van pass every couple hours, and the rest was quiet. And then as we went on, more vans, then the workers, and then lots of people, and then regular people came back, right? And so this whole process that they're going through is trying to think of and come up with ideas of how to help these villagers. And one of the great things that Mizo loves is Mizo loves sake, okay? And so he knew that this rice here in the Iitate area was well known for sake, and it was also a wonderful beef growing zone. People loved Iitate beef. And so one of the projects, it doesn't have to do with necessarily instrumentation directly, right? Except for the fact that we can help out with kind of understanding the agriculture. But his goal was to let's make sake from the rice and let's sell this Iitate rice sake to the people. That shows it's not radioactive. It's wonderful humans, but it's made with this beautiful Iitate rice that's been known for generations, as I understand it, as being this great sake, right? And also let's return this Iitate beef. You know, I've heard of Kobe beef, right? Here in the United States, I don't think we hear that, but Mizo assured me, he's like, do you know Kobe beef? Yes, I know Kobe beef. This was just as good, right? And so we need to return the Iitate beef there, because this was how they made their living, you know, on being able to sell these things for a really good price. And that was the goal. And it was fun for me. So they even established inside an old hospital, like a location for all these volunteers to go, right? If you have a lot of volunteers coming up, where are they going to go? Where are they going to sleep? What are they going to do to try to make these weekends meaningful? They converted this old hospital into a hostel. And so after the day was done, we went over to the hostel, and all these volunteers, I was talking to probably a 75, 80-year-old professor from the University of Tokyo. She taught like Japanese literature at the university, but just had heard about the effort was coming up. We got to talk for a long time. She spoke wonderful English, and she was telling me about this effort. They all go into the kitchen. I went into the kitchen. We all prepared meals there together and came out and ate these wonderful traditional Japanese meals together and talked about tomorrow, what are we going to go do? How are we going to make our time really meaningful things? Okay, you're going to the greenhouses. You're going over to do the rice planting. You're going to do the testing on the soil to see the infiltration. You're going over to talk to the growers about what they can grow and how we're going to turn that into a commodity we can sell. And so they were making all these plans, and you know, we were just a part of it. We were welcomed in there. They're like, oh, we're so happy you did all these things. We're like, we didn't do much, but we're happy to be here today, helping out.
Right. Were there any other, you know, I guess in particular, any other specific challenges or roadblocks that you faced there? I mean, aside from, you know, boars digging up the fields.
Well, it was really, I mean, first of all, it's just getting out there, right? For the government to say, hey, it's safe to actually go in there. And so you had to wear a radiation tag. You had to, you know, you couldn't stay overnight in the area initially. And simply, I mean, really, I mean, my biggest roadblock there was the enormity of the task. When you walk in there, you're like, I don't know what we're going to do. This is so big.
How do you eat an elephant, right?
Right. How do we start? And luckily, people on the project were, you know, they were forward thinking. They were visionary people who saw, you know, no matter what we do, if we do something and keep trying it, it's going to be meaningful. And that's essentially how they approached it. And so our roadblocks were mainly just trying, you know, a lot of, you know, when we kind of proved this experimentally, this good method of reclaiming soils actually worked. Big roadblock was essentially no one wanted to listen. And maybe on this particular, I mean, on this, we did some, but not a lot. But for future times, these things happen. I don't know what exactly is going to be the next disaster. I hope this never happens. This specific thing never happens again, but we don't know. But I hope the knowledge we brought along here and the techniques we developed could be used other places, right? You know, other roadblocks are just trying to really understand how, you know, this is an agriculture community. We need to get the agriculture out again, but there's a not surprising effect with the people who are by, which is we don't want your radioactive stuff. Yeah. And so, and that's still today, right? You know, if you're eating rice and there's potential that the rice has picked up some of the cesium, do you really want it? Now, we've done the work, right? Miso, the group did the work. They've shown that the cesium is gone and that it's not taken in the plants and it's safe for human consumption. But that was certainly one of the big roadblocks. Is initially, you know, people pay with their, you know, or vote with their wallets, and essentially the vote was no. We're not going to have this produce. Now, my understanding is that that's improved. that they've worked and done enough to help the public see, hey, this is safe for consumption, and you're benefiting these people who so desperately need your support in this time of need. Yeah. And I understand it's better.
Before we talk about the future, what were some of the findings, aside from in general that the cesium is gone, that the rice is safe for human consumption? Were there any other findings that were of interest to this project?
Yeah, so I mean, I think we learned a lot about, when we have a disaster, when we need to do some remediation, some of the right ways, and I don't say wrong ways, but more challenging ways to do this. I think a lot of, to change, to try to remediate a difficult situation. I think a lot of the learning we had was really connected between the sociology and the environment. And I've gone to conferences here, and a lot of times it's not what I'm used to, but a lot of the discussion is here's the sociology of it all. Here's what happens to a displaced people who for all of their lives lived in one place. And now, I mean, these were really people who've grown up there all of their lives, and suddenly they're living in a parking lot. And you can imagine, for me, we moved several times, in our married life, my wife and I, but these people had not necessarily. And then from being free and on the land, they move over there. So some of the findings that they learned that the project kind of went through is, hey, what happens to people when these kind of disasters happen? And then, and I can't speak deeply about that. I was mostly, in a listening mood. Wow, that's interesting. And when I visited one of these relocation camps, I was in the community center, kind of with these people, and they gather everybody together and they just go through these exercise sessions. So we did it. They were like, "You're here, you're going to exercise." And so we exercised, and we saw the healthcare efforts there, and then we talked to some of the people who had been displaced, and just psychologically the impact was incredible. It's hard to really. I mean, they were resilient, and so talking to them, they weren't bitter. They weren't, saying, the devils who did this to us. But the light was somewhat out, right? It was hard. It was very, very hard. And so, if we switch to the scientific learning that we did, I think we learned that recovery is possible. That remediation has to take all kinds of parts from, as you talked about, from the forest to the water, to the water balance, to the agricultural soils, to the homes, and all this kind of stuff. We also learned that it's really difficult to work with soil outside its native condition, and that we don't really have a great process for remediation. Even in another situation where there wasn't much clay, let's say here, where we live in the Pacific Northwest, we've got a lot of silt loam. There is some clay in the soil. But I'm not sure whether we could even use this remediation process because A, I'm not sure it would be bound on the cesium, and B, possibly even worse, it's really hilly here, right? So these disasters, when they're not anticipated, when we don't have a great plan, or even if we do have a great plan and just the situation doesn't work, it creates difficulty.
Yeah. So what is the current state of the project, and along with that, what are kind of the next steps, or what does the future have in store for it?
One of the cool things I think about the project is they're just pacing it, right? And so the last time I went there before the pandemic, we were putting up a lot of really beautiful greenhouses. The initial greenhouses were a little bit, built a little bit fast, maybe, they weren't as tight as you'd kind of expect to see a greenhouse. They were hoop houses, and they were put up probably by people who didn't know a lot about how to do hoop houses. The last time I went there, and some of that's on Meter's video, Fukushima video, they were gorgeous. I mean, the rows were tight, they were bigger hoop houses. There was a lot more room, and the environmental controls were really good. And so, I think it's really focusing on what these people can do to make a living. And I think that's just growing step by step. So we're getting more fields that we've figured out how to at least get a little fertility back. We're growing rice and we're producing. I think the future holds trying to increase the capacity of the people of Fukushima to be able to produce like they did before, with the end goal being a return to quote unquote normalcy, which wouldn't be for Akubu-san. He grew flowers. He's in his mid to late 70s now, and he's like, I'm happy here. I am growing flowers, and that is recovery for Akubu-san, and so that's just fine. For Maneo-san, he wants to grow lots of plants. He's also, he's in his early 70s, so he's not young either. He's full of life, and he's growing in lots of greenhouses, and that's what recovery looks like to this people. And I think that the goals of the NGO, the non-government organization that's running this effort, is just to make sure that their success is returning to as much of normal as possible.
Yeah. And I think that I don't know if something along these lines has happened, a project along these lines has happened, at Chernobyl or like a 3 Mile Island, but this seems like a really unique longitudinal study to really see how ecologically, environmentally, sociologically as well, how does a location recover from a disaster of this nature. So
you say unique, and I think what I know of Chernobyl and other disasters really is unique, and I think it's a testament to the Japanese people, because this could have been the same. When we went in the first time, it looked like the pictures of Chernobyl. Could have been the same, but the will of the people would not let that happen. Cared enough about the people who had been displaced to make sure that it didn't happen. And that's, if there's a host of inspiring stories that come out of here, but that's one of the beautiful ones, that they simply refuse to let that happen.
Right. Any final thoughts? Anything else that you'd want to add?
Well, I think that one of the funniest things about this is how it all came about. If we rewind all the way back to the beginning, I didn't know Mizo. Mizo was just some guy at the University of Tokyo, a wonderful, respected professor. And in 2001, one of our colleagues that works here at Meter Group was working at the University of Minnesota as a grad student. We went out there as a part of a national meeting. And while we were there, I said, hey, Doug, will you just take us out to your research site? I want to see what you're doing, because he and I had been graduate students together at Texas A&M. And so he gathered his major professor, Dr. John Baker, and we were going to hop in the minivan and go. And this guy came up, this Japanese guy, and he's like, hey, I want to go too. And I'm like, that's weird. I was just going to go with my friend, and I know John Baker well, and we were just going to go out there. And I'm a little taken aback, but like, okay, come on. So we all hopped in this car. And I can remember going to this diner, this traditional kind of American greasy spoon diner. And we all ordered burgers, and we're sitting there, and I'm talking to this Japanese professor and his good friend. And I said, hey, do you know one of my friends from graduate school, Kazuki? And he said, no. And I said, are you a soil physicist? And he said, yeah, I'm a soil physicist. I'm like, Kazuki and I are soil physicists too, and I'm absolutely sure that that's not a big community in Japan. You must know Kazuki. And he said, Kazuki? And I said, Kazuki Noborio. Yeah, you know him. And he's like, I don't know Kazuki. And I'm like, there's just no way. And he's like, okay, fine, just write it down. So I wrote down Kazuki Noborio. And I gave him the paper, and he said, Oh, you mean Kosuke. and that weird kind of interaction experience, we somehow got to be great friends. And then just later that year, I went over and visited Mizo, an amazing guy. I can now see why he jumped into that trip. Like, hey, why did you want to? Because he just loves to learn, loves to experience. And he did know Kosuke. And then it launched this friendship for, over 20 years now that Mizo and I have been collaborating on all kinds of fun stuff. And I asked, as an aside, I asked Kosuke later, I'm like, why did we call you Kazuki all these years if your name was Kosuke? And he said, I went to Texas, we were at Texas A&M, and I met Dr. Murray Milford, good old Texan. He said, hello, Kazuki. And I just said, I thought that's how they said it in Texas, so I was Kazuki. And I'm like, it would have been helpful to know you were actually Kosuke, because we didn't know. So that was one of the fun story, I guess, as we, on the podcast talking about things of science, these random meetings, and associations actually mean a ton. And so as you're going out and having these associations and looking for opportunities to collaborate, we can do great things. And this great thing, this thing that I value so much as a part of my career, came out of a chance meeting of driving out to a field and eating in a diner that was forced. Like initially I was like, what the heck? Why are you coming with us, Mizo? And I'm so glad he did, right?
Yeah. I think that's it. Anything else?
Nope.
You good? All right, our time is up today. Thank you again, Dr. Colin Campbell, for taking time to share your research with us.
My pleasure. It's been fun.
Stay safe, and we'll see you next time on We Measure the World.